Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Medicare Targeted Probe and Education, a new medical review model. All lines have been muted. The webinar will last 30 minutes, and we will have dedicated time after the presentation for Q&A. If you have questions throughout, simply type them in the comments section, and we will address them during the Q&A time. This webinar is being recorded and will be sent to each participant afterwards. Our speaker for today is Ian Mattis. Ian is a member of the Practice Optimization team. He worked previously for 16 years at the nation's largest Medicare administrative contractor in various roles on provider audits, data analysis, and education. Before joining Medicare, Ian worked for a hospital and Rite Aid Corporation in training and development. We appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us today. At this time, I will turn the webinar over to Ian.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. Just a quick reminder that no part of this presentation may be reproduced or transmitted by any form or by any means, so without written permission from my care leaders. Today's agenda, we're going to actually go through what is Targeted Probe and Educate. This is a brand new, fairly new model for Medicare as far as how they do their audits, and then we'll go into some background as to why they set this up and what happened and why we're moving to this new model. I'll go through provider and claim selection and how that works. We'll talk a little bit about the Targeted Probe and Educate process, and then we'll talk about preparing for a Targeted Probe and Educate review, which is very important. So Targeted Probe and Educate is a brand new model for Medicare administrative contractors to conduct audits of claims. It was mandated by the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or CMS. What TPE does is it replaces what used to be called service-wide reviews that were conducted by MACs for high-risk services. They would set up, say, a service-wide review that was focused on a particular service, and the claims were essentially selected at random. Individual providers were not really reviewed at a rate that represented a good claim sample to determine if they were non-compliant with Medicare rules. So what Targeted Probe and Educate does is it focuses only on providers who have the highest claim denial rates, who have billing practices that vary significantly from their peers. So CMS's intent here is to reduce the provider burden by lowering the number of audits and claim requests for individual providers. So they're trying to make it a little bit easier for you. Actually, TPE does not replace automated claim reviews. It's really, these are the ones that say they're edits to a diagnosis code, procedure diagnosis code combination, or edits for local coverage determinations, things like that. It also doesn't replace the audits that are done by other Medicare review contractors, and there's lots of them. The recovery auditors, such as Recovery Auditors or Comprehensive Error Rate Testing Program, you might have heard of those two programs. And actually, if you're on a TPE review, you're not excluded from other reviews. So what the intent of TPE is to encourage change through education. There isn't a larger education component in TPE. There's a lot more of education that the contractors are required to do. Rather than just audit your claims and send you a review letter, they actually are required to educate you a little bit about the process and try to get you in compliance without going through heavy-handed enforcement. So that's what the TPE process is. Back in 2014, TPE actually began as a pilot program. Hospital inpatient services were selected by CMS as the first test for this, because a lot of hospital inpatient services had very high error rates. CMS received a lot of positive comments throughout the pilot. They were very happy with what happened in 2014. So in August of 2015, it was actually expanded to home health services. And again, a lot of good positive reviews. Home health providers gave a lot of positive reviews about the whole process. So back in October 2017, just a few months ago, it was expanded to all Medicare administrative contractors as a Targeted Probe and Educate process now. Now this program, they learned a lot of lessons from the pilots, and they're applying them to the new program for the MACs. So we'll talk a little bit about the process right now. So one of the things in the pilots that CMS did was it was really a top-down approach. CMS selected topics for review, and every provider who billed the services were reviewed. Everybody. So if you had a particular code review that CMS picked, then they would look at every single provider, and that was very burdensome and very large for the MACs. Required a lot of work to get things done. And there wasn't really any flexibility for the MACs to address any local issues or issues that came up on their data analysis. And that really kind of put a crimp in what MACs were trying to do to keep the providers compliant. So it really was a lot costly to have that type of situation. So in 2017, what changed in the process is the MACs select the topics. Through their data analysis, they're going to pick topics like they normally would. They go through a lot of data analysis at MACs. They do claims and billing patterns. They also look at error rate data. So there's a lot of data that they look at, and they're going to select the services that are highest risk for the Medicare program. And what risk means is dollars at risk. Basically, how much is this going to net when we look at these issues? And also, they're going to look at services with high improper payment rates. So improper payment rates are determined by the comprehensive error rate testing contractor. The data is released to MACs on a yearly basis in November, actually, and you should really kind of familiarize yourself with the improper payment rate report. At some point, the MACs do post that on links to that on their website. You really ought to get a chance to take a look at it, because it really does drive a lot of what MACs do in their year when it comes to audits and reviews. So the goal of TPE model is, again, to target specific providers that represent a high risk of submission for non-compliant claims. So the data that they use for these providers is usually they look at a current 6-month period they compare a current 6-month period to a previous 6-month period. That's the normal process. So they look about a year's worth of data to try to see if they're going to detect any change in billing patterns or identify trends in new services. Then the summary data or statistically representative samples can be used if they're dealing with a large volume of data. So if you have a fairly large practice and you're billing a lot of claims per month, then they're going to use statistical sampling to take a look at that. Now, MACs put together baselines. This is what they do when they're comparing your billing patterns to the baselines of other providers to detect what we call aberrancies or abnormalities in billing. Now, a baseline can be a lot of different things. And sometimes that baseline depends upon what is the MAC looking at that time, or what is the best baseline to look at that for that service. So some of these baselines could be a certain number of standard deviations from the mean. It also could be a percent above the mean or median. So again, it all depends. If one other thing that they can look at is a percentage change in billing activity or payment changes. So if you were previously billing a low number of a procedure code and all of a sudden you're billing a lot of that procedure code, that could flag you for an audit. Also, a rate of change over specific periods of time can be looked at. If your rate of change goes up or down, then that could hit you up for an audit. One thing to note here is that billing certain services higher than peers or changes in billing patterns may trigger an audit, but that doesn't mean that your billing is non-compliant. I want to be very clear about that, because just because you have a change in billing patterns doesn't mean you're not complying with Medicare rules. So it's only through the MAC, only through a review of claims, can they really determine if you're billing properly, if your documentation supports services, rather than you. So the best thing to do is focus on proper documentation, focus on being compliant with Medicare rules, rather than focusing on, well, how do I bill to avoid an audit? You don't want to do that. You really want to look at, is my documentation in place? And if your documentation's fine, you're going to survive that audit. Also, there are referrals from internal and external sources. Internal MAC departments such as customer service, appeals. They can see certain patterns of things, and they can refer a provider for review, for data analysis, basically to take a look and then see if they're suspect for non-compliant billing. So also fraud contractors may refer providers because there was a tip received, say through through the fraud contractor's data analysis. And again, other review contractors such as RACs or even comprehensive error rate testing can send providers to the MAC for further data analysis and review if needed. So the data analysis also may show that a provider is low risk. Again, in this case, you're going to be excluded from medical review, but that doesn't mean you might not get audited in the future. It just means that they consider you a low risk. So let's move on to what is the targeted probe and educate process. Well, targeted probe and educate consists of 3 rounds of review. So there's 3 different rounds of review. And this process is the same for every round. It's the same for all 3 rounds. So in the first thing you're going to get a letter. And then what's going to happen is they'll set the number of claims that are selected. And then they'll do the reviews, they'll do data analysis, you'll be educated, and then 45 to 56 days after education before the CMS has actually mandated that 45 days, above 45 days must pass before they can put you on the next round if you're found to be aberrant. So let's talk a little bit through the process in depth. A notification letter is going to be sent to the address on your enrollment record. This is why enrollment records are very, very important. It could be a physical location rather than a billing office or an administrative office. So make sure that your enrollment records are up to date and that you really have all your proper addresses on so you don't miss this letter. The letter is going to outline the services that are being reviewed and the reason you were selected for review, any data analysis that was used, and is going to explain the TPE process. Now, the MAC's going to select a minimum of 20 claims and a maximum of 40 claims for review. This sample size is significant enough to be representative of how accurately you might be billing for those, and if you have the supporting documentation to meet the rules and requirements of Medicare. The important thing here's the third bullet, is probably the most important on this screen, is that additional documentation requests or ADR letters are sent for each individual claim. And again, this could be a physical location rather than administrative office. So if you have a number of different locations, you probably want to alert them, hey, if a Medicare letter comes in, if it comes in from your Medicare contractor, and it's pretty obvious some of these letters, they need to respond to that quickly. Don't just set it aside on somebody's desk and wait, because you usually have 45 days from the date of the letter to send in that documentation to respond to that ADR. I would plan on 30 days. Set your clock and it's the date of the letter. So if it takes like 2 weeks to get back to the person who is supposed to respond to these, that's going to cut into that 45 days because it's always from the date of the letter. So you want to plan on 30 days because you want to get your responses in as quickly as possible in case there's any delays, if you have to ship documentation, or if the MAC takes a couple of days to process your records requests, that's going to take a little bit of time. So you want to make sure 30 days is probably what your target for getting that information into Medicare. It's probably the best effort. And you do want to make every effort to get the documentation in on time because your Medicare administrative contractor is going to use non-responses and include that in your provider error rate. So if you don't respond within the time frame, that's considered a non-response. So say you're sampled at 20 claims, which is the minimum sample, and you missed 5 claims, that means you already have a 25% minimum error rate before any claim reviews are done. So I want to kind of, that's really the importance of responding to these letters, because it is included in that error rate, and that can really inflate your error rate if you're not responding. One thing about medical reviews, all medical reviews are performed by a clinician. That's Medicare regulations. So clinicians can be either licensed nurses or physicians, and in most cases, the reviews are done by nurses. So at the conclusion of a review, an error rate is calculated, and I just remember that, again, we're going back to the previous slide, non-responses are included in that error rate. So if you don't respond, you're definitely going to have an issue with your error rate. So providers are then sent results letters, and that results letter offers you one-on-one education. Take it. Use that education, learn about it. Regardless of what your error rate is, I would say go in there and use that education. You're going to get a call either from the clinician who actually, the clinical reviewer, or a member of the MAC's provider outreach and education team to discuss your review. So educations can be done by teleconference, a webinar, or they can actually be a face-to-face visit. If the MAC has the ability to do a face-to-face visit, they can do they can come out to your practice, which is a really great thing. So if they do offer that, I would take it. While education is offered at the end of the review, one of the things about this is education could occur during the review, so you might get a call somewhere in the middle of the review if it's an easily resolved issue. Now here's the issue. There's thresholds that are set, but they're set by the MAC, and it varies. So if the error percentage is, it really, when you look at these thresholds, it's going to vary based on the provider. It's going to vary based on the services under review. So the improper payment rate for a specific service or other data can be used in this determination, and it's really going to vary wildly based on the services. So we're not going to know, you're not going to know up front what is the threshold. You're probably not going to know. They're not going to say, well, a 30% error rate's a threshold, a 40% error rate's a threshold. You're not going to know that. So this is important, that the determination of whether you move on to an additional rounds of review is based on improvement from round to round. So you are being educated on each round, and they do give time for you to correct any billing practices that they might see, so that they can get this in line. So if you are under threshold, if you're under that percentage, whatever that is, because we're never really going to know until it happens, then you are removed from subsequent reviews for at least 12 months. So you won't be reviewed at all for another year. If you are over threshold, as I pointed out previously, the MAC must wait at least 45 days, usually 45 to 56 days, to begin the next round. So this gives you a little bit of time to start correcting any issues that might have been found in that first round of targeted probe and educate. So after round 3, if you're still over threshold, what happens is the Medicare Administrative Contractor will then ask CMS, well, what should we do with this provider? And that could be a lot of different things. It could be extrapolation. They could take your error rate and extrapolate it and ask for funds to be returned or monies to be sent back based on an extrapolated error rate. They could refer you to the fraud contractor. That certainly is one of the things. They could refer you to the recovery audit contractor for further reviews. CMS could come to the MAC and decide we're going to put you on 100% prepay. And one of the things that CMS has the authority, which they don't use very often, but it's there, is they could revoke you from the Medicare program. It's a very rare situation. It means that you'll be excluded from the Medicare program for at least 3 years. So that's really one of the things, some of the things that CMS could do if you continue to be over threshold through round 3. Now, CMS did develop a flow chart, which is a nice visual of the TPE process. We'll send it when we send the presentation out. This flow chart will be out there with it. But it really just walks you through each round and then what could possibly happen at the end of each round. One of the things about in this process, if you do get denials, you can appeal them. Appeals must be submitted within 120 days from the MAC denial date. So it's important, again, to send your appeals in timely, because there's very, very limited situations where a MAC will accept an untimely appeal. Also, it's recommended to provide any additional documentation to support the claim. So this could be a letter explaining circumstances or documentation from other dates of service that support that claim. One thing you don't want to do is just send the same records again, expecting a different result. Even though appeals are conducted by different reviewers, Medicare reviewers and appeals reviewers receive similar training. So all things being equal, they should come to the same conclusion with the same documentation. And that's the goal of the training that MACs perform. So when you look at that, it really does come down to, with the same documentation, a clinical reviewer and an appeals reviewer should come to the same result. So don't just send in records again. Really try to send in additional supporting documentation, and don't just rebill the services. Most likely, if you do rebill the services, it's just going to result in a denial of a new claim. Also, if you're rebilling with different codes just to receive payment, that could be considered an abuse of billing, and that really does cause problems, sometimes worse problems than just appealing the services. So really just appeal. And one of the things about appeals is successful appeals are removed from your error rate calculation. So that's a good thing. So if you appeal, you're going to get that removed. So now let's talk a little bit about preparing for TPE reviews, because really there's so many different reviews being conducted. It's really not a matter of if you're going to be reviewed, but when. So being prepared is going to really help you. One of the things you want to do is stay up to date on Medicare changes. MACs put out a lot of information every day, every week about changes in Medicare. Try to stay up to date on what's going on. Educate people in your practice on compliance issues. And then also update your enrollment as soon as any changes occur. Because remember, those letters go out to the addresses on the enrollment record. If you didn't send in any, if you didn't change your address, that you could be missing letters that are for requesting records, and that could impact your reviews. Also, try to perform internal audits on a regular basis. Internal audits are the best way to uncover any issues and correct any issues before a Medicare audit. And I'd recommend auditing should be at least once a year with a valid claim sample, maybe 20 claims, such as Medicare uses. So a lot of common errors. This slide is just a quick common error slide that I've seen in my years in Medicare. Is we really know response is one of the biggest ones. And I've kind of repeated that over and over, so I'm going to skip that. Signatures are an issue. Really take a look at if you're handwriting your signatures, have a signature log ready and available. If you have if you're using an EMR or an electronic health record, make sure your signatures are compliant. And a lot of MACs can help you with that. Just take a look at the MAC guidance. Missing pages. Make sure that you are copying all pages of that record when you send it in, before you send it in, because if it's missing a page, if it jumps from page 4 to page 6, what's on page 5 might actually be what's needed to support that date of service. Also, incorrect dates of service. Again, check against the ADR, the documentation request, to make sure that you're sending in the correct dates of service, because an incorrect date of service is going to get you in pretty much an automatic denial. Also make sure you're sending in records for the right patient. It's very, very important. This seems very basic stuff, but I can tell you a lot of providers fail because of lots of these issues, and also illegible records. If you're still using handwritten records, you can take the time to transcribe that record before sending it in. It's going to go a long way toward getting a good result. I listed for you on this slide just some of the MAC websites. If you don't know your MAC's website, take a look at the state you're in, and this will certainly help you out. Also, some references for today's used in today's presentation. And just to wrap this up, just as you look to streamline, be sure to keep the MyCare suite in mind. I mean, we have a lot at iCare Leaders. We do have a lot of different choices to help you through this, to monitor your services, to help you with documentation. So you have that choice and flexibility of a fully integrated workflow that works for your practice needs. So we have everything from EHR to revenue cycle to analytics, and these completely integrated solutions and services are designed to shoulder the operational burden and help you run your practice by streamlining every aspect on it. So now it's time for a little bit of Q&A. I'll turn it back to Teresa.
Thank you, Ian. We had 2 questions come in. The first one is, what is MAC?
A MAC is a Medicare administrative contractor. They used to be called carriers. Now they're called MACs.
And the next question was, how can I check my error rate?
I did see that question. You won't be able to. You won't. It's not something that you're going to be able to look at until you finish a round of reviews. So in that situation, you're just going to have to wait till you get your letter back, and that's going to show you your error rate.
And we had one other question that just came in. So is MAC just DME?
No, MACs are the AB. There is actually they're all called Medicare administrative contractors now, but durable medical equipment contractors are entirely different from your Medicare AB contractors, which the A handles the AB, the MACs, AB MACs handle hospital and physician claims.
Okay, and that wraps up all the questions we had. Just a reminder that we will be sending out a copy of this recording. We do not send the PowerPoint document by itself, but we do send out the video recording. So you will receive that in the upcoming days. And thank you for joining, and have a great day.
Teresa, I'm going to just jump in here because there is one more question about targeting specific CPT codes.
Okay.
That does, again, targeting specific CPT codes, yes, they will. MAC will target a specific CPT code. Depending on their data analysis, if it shows that code is at high risk, if it's one of the higherly billed a lot, if it's billed a lot and it's at high risk based on error rates, yes, they're going to target specific CPT code for that audit. I think that's the last question.
Okay, great. Thank you everybody for joining, and look for the recording to be sent out in the coming days.
Thank you.